The first idea of ending a practice of serfdom appeared in the minds of Russian ruling class in the mid-18th century. Catherine the Great wrote in her memoirs that serfdom was unjust and ineffective. She was met with both sides of the argument. Her legislative assembly opposed her on the matter, but her closest advisors were urging her to end the serfdom. Unfortunately for the peasants, the first faction prevailed, and even managed to expand the serfdom into Ukraine. In the next century, with Napoleon moving through Europe like a hot knife through butter, he brought liberty for many peasants. One of the countries that abolished serfdom was Prussia, after the defeat and peace of Tilsit in 1807. Napoleon was defeated in Russia, which also straightened the position of autocratic authority and the powers of landowners. However, the first moves toward abolishment of serfdom were initiated by Alexander I in 1803. He allowed voluntary emancipations of serfs by their landowners. His successor, Nicholas I, appointed a committee to study the status of the peasantry, but nothing came of it. But in 1837, he transformed the status of peasants on public lands to that of free agriculturalists. Since they were already working on public lands, their status was already better than of those working on private lands. But still, they received local services such as famine relief, healthcare, education, assistance with technological innovations. They were charged a tax on the land instead of on the household. It was the first reform of substance. By mid-19th century, it was obvious that serfdom, alongside being outdated at this point, was also ineffective. The peasants had no initiative to innovate, and their rigid social position was affecting the whole economy, because after all, they were not allowed to leave the land of their landowners. The peasants' revolts were common, especially after 1848, when revolution swept through Europe. In 1857, Tsar Alexander II famously said that it's better to emancipate the serfs from above than to see them to do from below by themselves. Since there was no sanctions against the mistreatment of serfs, they were dealt with harshly. Landlords were believing that serfs are incapable to managing their own affairs. All the shortcomings of current system in Russia were exposed during the Crimea War in 1850s, when Ottomans, alongside Western powers, managed to beat Russian forces. The Russian elite finally learned their lesson. The Western powers were way more technologically advanced and were able to beat more numerous Russian army. So finally, on 4th of December 1858, Alexander I announced that he will abolish serfdom. One reason was trying to modernize the country after Crimean War. But the other, maybe more important one, was the banking crisis that was caused by Crimean War. The crisis started with high inflation that was caused by massive purchases of grain near the battleground in southern Russia. So demand for grain was high, but the supply was limited. So to buy same amount of grain as in the past, you would have to pay a lot more, which also caused lack of available money for other things. The state's budget needed a stable banking system. While state budget was being filled with direct and indirect taxes, state banks were financing extraordinary government's expenses, such as wars. When direct and indirect taxes were not enough, the state banks, because there were no private banks, had to print more money. They already did that during the Napoleonic Wars, which caused high inflation in the 1820s. In the 1830s, Minister of Finance, with his conservative fiscal policies, managed to withdraw sums of money from circulation and generated budget surplus. So the state owned a loan bank for the landowners, a commercial bank for short-term lending to merchants, and two saving banks used to cover state's deficit. These banks were receiving deposits and paying interest rates on them. If the state needed money for investments that couldn't be raised differently, they would lower interest rates on deposits, causing depositors to take back their deposits. So it was functioning as a central bank. The state started to consider increasing their tax revenues by increasing tax base. Or in other words, what would happen if peasants were left to manage their own economic lives? In 1861, there was 60 million peasants in European part of Russia. They could be put in three categories. Privately owned serfs, they were paying their obligations in labor dues, money, or a combination of both. The second category were the serfs living on public land. They were mainly paying in money their obligations toward the state. They were in much better position than the ones on private lands. And finally, in third category was over 2 million serfs living and working on the lands owned by the imperial family. Finally, on February 19, 1861, the abolition of serfs happened. It was a set of laws regulating the matter. The government decentralized the governance while freeing the labor force. When it came to emancipation of serfs, they were given a choice. They were to be given land as their own property, but if they wanted to keep the whole piece of land that they worked on, they would have to pay for 2 years to their old landowners for using the land. Or they can get their freedom immediately with no obligations left. But they only get a quarter of the land they are entitled to. By 1882, only 3% of peasants agreed to the second option.